Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amoco Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amoco. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Please find your favorite Amoco or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amoco for all your clay and glaze needs.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 469 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Heidi Fahrenbacher. She runs Bella Joy Pottery in Plainville, Michigan, and makes multiple lines of functional pottery. In this interview, we talk about her path to being a maker, as well as how working the show circuit has influenced her formula for pricing. To see examples of her work, you can visit her website. That's bellajoypottery.com. I did want to note that we talk about grief due to homicide and suicide in this interview, as well as the mental health ramifications of dealing with that over a long amount of time. Before we get to this interview, I had a few other announcements. The first of which is that Heidi will be taking part in Michigan Mud, which is a wonderful conference that's happening this weekend, June the 16th and 17th at Northwestern Michigan College. This year's keynote speaker is going to be Bede Clark, and there will also be lectures by Jessica Brandel, Brian Kakis, Susan McHenry, and a bunch of other folks. If you'd like to find out more information about that, you can go to mitchclay.com and look for the Michigan Mud link. Also wanted to plug a solo show I have at the In Tandem Gallery at Bakersville, North Carolina. That's on now, and this is the first solo show I've had in maybe 3 or 4 years. You can find that at intandemgallery.com. And lastly, I wanted to thank the folks that support this show. We are listener-supported, so I'd like to thank Daniel Vance and Kathleen Nicholson for their recent contributions. If you'd like to get involved, you can make a donation at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Can you describe where you are in Michigan?
Sure. So I'm going to first hold my hand up right here. And so it's called Plainwell. And I always kid that it's called that because, well, it's just very plain. But it's about 20 minutes north of Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is right in between Chicago and Detroit. Like exactly right in between.
So what brought you to that area? How did you end up settling there?
Oh gosh. So I'm originally, like I was born in Illinois, and we moved to Michigan when I was an infant. And then we kind of moved a lot, like around the area. I just went to Kalamazoo College, which is a liberal arts college in Kalamazoo. And then I graduated. I was actually going to move to California. This is such a goofy story. But I met my current husband Like I had all my worldly possessions in California. Like I was moving to San Diego. And then like 2 weeks before I was going to go, I met him and I was like, oh, which I feel like is not me at all. That's why this story I think is so funny, because I'm like, I'm independent and strong and, and then I was like, oh, you're really nice. So then I stuck around and then I started working at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. And then I worked for another potter. And then I was like, I bet I could try and do this on my own. And I was only, what was I, like 25, which seems like forever ago. But I also feel like I needed that youthful arrogance to do it, It was funny because I've been watching the show Bones. Did you ever watch that show on television?
No, I'm familiar with it, but I don't think I watched it. Who's the star of that? Like who was in that?
Emily Deschanel, like Zoe Deschanel's sister. I never watched it when it was on TV, but so I've been watching it because it's just like, it's easy to watch. It's like Law and Order, And they've been talking about like the recession. I kind of like forgot about it, but I was like, oh my God, like I was trying to run a business then. Like that's why I was so stressed out, because I know a lot of people are kind of feeling the same way now because the economy's kind of, we'll just say, weird.
Let's talk about the recession. I too forget about it because of the pandemic. It's weird. Like now the pandemic is just like, it's kind of erased my mind before the pandemic.
Right. Yeah.
What was your experience of the recession? Like how did that affect you as an early business person?
It was difficult. I remember telling people, like, I think it was easier for me because I was used to my income fluctuating, as opposed to if you're getting like a steady paycheck. But people just, they didn't have as much disposable income. And because at that time, my pricing wasn't where it should have been, like every sale, I wasn't actually making money. So like that was very difficult. It was actually during the recession. I did apply to go to grad school. I just didn't get in. And then felt so rejected. I never applied again.
Do you mind if I ask you where you applied? Because I applied twice, was rejected 9 times. Let's see. I was rejected 8 times and got into one school, and that was the University of Florida. So I am right there with you.
Oh, well, see, and then I heard that, and I don't know because I'm not, a professor at an institution, that a lot of times they want you to apply twice to show that you're actually interested, which I wish I would have known that before, so I wouldn't have taken it so personally. But I applied to the University of Michigan, Michigan State. I think I applied to Notre Dame, Ohio University. This is so long ago. Ohio University. I think I applied to LSU because I went to a Matt Long workshop once and I just thought like he was the coolest guy in the world. I mean, I'm sure he is still like a very cool guy, but I was like, man, I want to learn under him. So
he was the original reason I went to Florida as a postbac. At that time, he was the technician.
Oh,
and
really?
Then later is now at Ole Miss, which is University of Mississippi.
Oh, maybe that's where I applied. Yeah. Okay.
The reason I was asking is that I think there's the way you think your career is going to go, and then there's the way your career actually goes. And for me, those have not been that similar. Like my path has been so windy and all over. And can you talk about it and frame it in that way? Like what did you maybe think was going to happen, and then what has happened in terms of being a business person in Clay?
Okay, I can, because I remember in undergrad, I was planning on just going to graduate school right afterwards. And my ceramics professor at the time, she still teaches at Kalamazoo College. Her name's Sarah Lindley. She was like, well, you don't have to go to graduate school right after undergrad. And I remember being like, what? That's an option? And so I was like, okay. After I graduated, when I was in college, I studied abroad in Germany. And that was just like, that was great. So I feel like I'm going to have to tell you a lot.
That's okay. We have time. We're eventually going to get to pricing, but let's.
Okay, that's right. Okay, we got to back up because my college experience was not. It was normal in some regards, but it was not in a lot of regards. So When I was a sophomore in college, I played golf, Division III golf. My teammate was murdered on campus. She was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, and then he killed himself.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Oh, thanks. So, that just like, that really shaped a lot of who I was and who I am. And I don't blame the school for that happening. But I do blame them for how they handled it. And so, like, I kind of was a little distrustful of higher learning institutions, for right or wrong, it's just how it happened to be. So when she said I didn't have to go to grad school right after undergrad, I was like, freedom. Because, I thought I would go to grad school, and I didn't really see myself as being a professor. I did an apprenticeship when I was in college for a local potter. His name's Tom Kendall. And I learned so much. That was like a 9-month apprenticeship. And he would just like make pots and listen to NPR. And I was like, that is what I want. So that's really what I tried to do. So anyway, I went on study abroad in Germany, and like I loved being there. And so after I graduated from college, I was like, I need to find any way possible to move back to Europe. And so I found a program where you could get a work visa to like move to the UK. So I moved to London, and it was very expensive. I was like, I can't afford this. So then I moved to Scotland. I moved to Edinburgh, and I was there for about half a year. And then when I got back, I just kept taking ceramics classes, and that's always been like the constant in my life, like swimming. I really love swimming, and I really love ceramics. So I just like, I kept taking classes, and I really don't know. I think like, and not to get too like mental health, all of it like really fast, but I think because of like the trauma of my friend being murdered, I couldn't really think about the future, if that makes sense, because my worldview was shattered, not to be like dramatic, but because I was so young, I was only 19. And so I think it was shattered, but then I was also very grateful for just like being able to make a pot, like to have access to a community studio and make pottery.
Yeah, and mental health is something that I've talked to people about, and I'm really welcome this conversation. So I appreciate you being willing to talk about it.
Yeah, I was just trying not to cry.
I think when you have either trauma or grief, it's easy to float off. That's the feeling I have, is like I'm so in my head that I'm not embodied. And clay is great for like putting me in my body, in a space and in a time.
Right.
I think when you go to school and you study clay, there's like an academic perspective that's very different to the way you live your clay life now. So how did that develop? Like, how did you get to being a studio potter?
That's a really good question, because I did primarily sculptural ceramics in undergrad. I mean, I would throw pots, but like, I was more into, I think a lot of people are, they're, into sculptural ceramics. It's kind of hard. It's harder to sell if you want to be a studio potter. It's not impossible, but it is harder to do. And so I was really into making chairs. I used to make chairs out of clay. And that was actually really helpful, because I made one that was like a memorial to my friend. Her name was Maggie Wardle, that was murdered. And so it was like a Graulig porcelain. It was hand built, slab constructed. Well, it was slabs, and then afterwards I glued it together. But it had little holes in it. And so what I did is I lit a lot of little candles under it. And so when the candles were lit, if you put your hand on the seat, it was a little bit warm. And I wanted to mimic that sensation of when like someone's been sitting on a chair and then they're gone. Like a lot of even I always say my functional work has like a little story behind it. And so for a long time I was putting little chair drawings and chair decals on my functional pottery. But I mean, I mainly just started doing it because I had to make money. So So I could get like the chairs into, shows and things, but it was more difficult to sell the chairs.
So in the greater Michigan area, how if you're a young potter, like how do you make it? Do you do fairs? Because I know there's big fairs in Ann Arbor has I can't remember the name of that one, but whatever that big fair is, like that's been going on forever. Was that a goal, or how did you make it work early on?
Yeah, so it was. So when I was like the assistant to the lab tech at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, and his name was Michael Gunderson at the time. And he like kind of took me under his wing and showed me like which shows to apply to. And like we're going so far back, like it was like you had to take slides, you know. So he helped me like set that all up and take slides. And at that time I didn't even have a booth because a lot of times they want an image of your booth. So like he let me borrow his booth and set it up with my pottery and take that photo. But at first I just started off doing like little one-day shows, craft fairs and things, and then just tried to progress to bigger and bigger shows like the Ann Arbor Art Fair. And there used to be, I don't even know if they have this anymore, but there used to be a book that you could buy at art fairs, and it would like rank the different art fairs and like how well artists did there. This is kind of a fun interview. I forgot about all this stuff. So you would buy that book, and then it would say like when the event was, where it was, like how much artists made, how many people attended, which was actually really useful.
In the competition for those, like what I remember is that getting into them was a really big deal. And I think, like now I'm trying to think of the East Coast, because every region also has like kind of a different set. But close to me, the Philadelphia Art Museum show, the Smithsonian show, like there's a couple like East Coast ones that are really big. And then, obviously Ann Arbor, but it's such a specific way to do business that almost I know they still exist, but it feels pre-internet because as soon as people could sell online, there was a couple years where I feel like the fair system as a whole dipped, and now it's like come back as a different animal. But how long did you do like in-person selling versus like moving all online? Or not all online, but more online?
So now I'm mainly all online, but I sold for a long time. Like my last art fair was 2019. To the people who like make a living doing art fairs and they're still doing it, like good for you. That is hard work. And I did all my shows alone. I remember like in March, I would like start training, like I better start like lifting weights and running because it's a workout doing those shows, especially with pottery, So, and it's hard to, you miss a lot when you're gone all the time doing those. I'm kind of glad that chapter is closed.
We're going to come back to business stuff, but I wanted to kind of take a sidetrack into your aesthetic and thinking about the way you approach color. Because I notice in the way you write about your work, you're often talking about color. So it seems both visually important, but also like it's a part of the story of who you are, your understanding of color. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This might be one of those areas where I'm not going to answer this correctly the first time, but
Okay.
I will try. Like I said, well, I think it all ties together. The like my friend that was murdered, and then I feel like I have had a lot of close people to me die, which, is unfortunate. And funerals are always kind of black, and I actually, it's funny because I'll say to people, well, I love color, and then I'm like dressed in black. But I do love color because it's like this time of year in Michigan, it's been very gray, like just gray. And then you see little like a daffodil will start to bloom, and it's kind of like hope. Like to me, color embodies hope. And like the one line I've created, brighter days, like color to me symbolizes brighter days ahead. Like, I mean, we could even take it so far as like a sunset, right? A beautiful sunset. hopefully the beginning, hopefully, see hope again, hopefully the beginning of a brighter day. I know I'm going to keep going back to this. When my friend was murdered, I made a decision because it's very hard, and the grief, murder is different. The grief with murder is different. And I just made a decision, like, I am going to every day try and be like as positive as I can, and color really embodies that for me.
Can you talk about, if you're comfortable, kind of the practical aspects of mental health when it comes to that? Because like you said, murder is so, like, no one is expecting that. Like, there's no way to prepare. There's no way to get ahead of it. It's more
No.
like, this has happened. Now I have to put the pieces back together. So how did you do that?
Well, my therapist tells me I did the best that I could.
And if this is too personal, we can leave this part out.
No, I think this is really important. I actually think this is really important because, there's a lot of, like, and I'm not trying to trigger anyone, but a lot of mass shootings going on. And this was on campus, so it's considered domestic violence, but it's also considered like a school shooting, right? And I think a lot of times they, I think of it as like a ripple effect. And it creates a ripple effect, and how, even though, like, my friend is dead and the perpetrator is dead, we're still left with this, and how do you move forward, like you said? And you just kind of have to take it one day at a time, because the anger you feel is like nothing else. Like, I know that they say that, there's the stages of grief, and anger is one of them. But murder, I think it's comparable to sexual assault, in my opinion, because something is stolen from you, like you said, and you can't get it back, and you can't prepare. And, it's hard. And that's, like I said, like, I decided to try and be positive, because you can become very bitter. I feel like that just doesn't help. And I'm not saying that, like, I didn't have really bad days, and because I did, and like I said, so I went to therapy probably about like 4 months after it happened, because I remember saying to my mom, I think this is something that could potentially mess me up for the rest of my life. And she was like, okay. But, the thing is, I didn't have a good therapist. And he invalidated my feelings. He told me not to be so angry. I feel like now no one would say that, but this was like in 1999, which doesn't seem that long ago, but it actually was a really long time ago. And so I didn't, like, let myself express how I was feeling. And so I kind of, like, just bottled everything up, which is not healthy at all. Did I answer your question at all?
You did.
Okay.
And I think about this way that ceramics can be a way to deal with our emotions, because that, definitely has been the way it is for me. And you didn't say this specifically, but I think some type of productivity can help with grief, because it's so overwhelming. I've had a domestic violence death in my family as well. And it's been really interesting to see how different members of my family have dealt with it. Like, some have been what I would say is like march forward, keep looking up. And some, I think, I mean, I don't want to share too much of their story, but I feel like maybe they have really, like a turtle pulling its head in a shell. Like, the protective mechanism of psychology is like, I'm not going to let someone hurt me like this again. But ceramics is great because or anything that's process oriented, because the process almost feels like pulls you forward.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Because clay, it doesn't wait. I mean, you can still make those, like, nice little tote damp boxes, right? But you still have to go back to it, so.
So when you think about color as hope, I like this concept, and I think this is a little bit of human nature. Like I think we really need color. Like it provides something psychologically, and you put it to words that it's hope. But how does that play out in when you're developing a line of work? Because you're often working like in a kind of a series that has different color palettes for the series. So how do you get to that?
So I like to look at pictures, and so a lot of times I feel like I'm influenced subconsciously. And, like I think a lot of times people are really concerned that people are copying them. And they could be, some people are going to do that, but sometimes it's just, subconscious. Like you keep seeing these things. It's like when you want to buy a red car, and then all of a sudden everywhere you look, there's red cars. So, so like for me, and it's like I'll get this idea in my head of like, oh, I'll see a picture and like I'll like a certain part of it. This is cool. And then it's like, oh, I just start seeing it everywhere. And I'm not the kind of person that an idea like pops in my head and then like 2 weeks later I make something. It simmers a long time. And then, I like to explore it. I love making glaze and glazing. And I know like a lot of potters don't like glazing. That is my favorite part. Like I love it. I just think it like opening the kiln after, a bunch of experiments and seeing what happens. I don't think there's anything better in ceramics, in life, yes, but in ceramics. So I do a lot of coloring with colored pencils. I'll do some like drawing. I really like using colored pencils, the way they blend. If I'm trying to figure out what kind of glazes go together or just kind of what I'm trying. It's not even, I think that's the other thing with color. When I put colors together, yes, the harmony of the colors is very important to me, but the way the color combinations make people feel is more important. So that's what I try and elicit, like a feeling more than just a color combination.
And I think that is the advantage of, we were talking about selling in art fairs and things where you see the buyer and you can see how people react. Like they will light up to certain color combinations or to just certain work in general. But when you think about, like, I looked at your wholesale line, the forms are relatively simple. There's like kind of like a tricolor glaze system, and then there's speckles. So it's this sense of I almost think of that as almost like a nostalgia thing. So could you talk about that, blending the iron speck with like pretty bright yellow, pink, things like that?
I don't know, 20 years I only used porcelain. And then I just bought like a bag of stoneware just to play. And I made some things and it had the speckles. And I was like, oh, these are really fun. And I feel like it was, you work with red clay, right?
Mm-hmm. I do. Yeah.
So porcelain is very finicky, and the stoneware was it was very forgiving. And back to the whole feeling thing, like I feel like my progression as a person, it really kind of spoke to me because the stoneware is so forgiving. Like it doesn't crack as much. The speckles like just hide everything. Everything. I couldn't believe it. I was like, are people who use stoneware cheating? Like this is like so easy. So when I started doing that, I was like, well, this is great. And I had always used like a translucent glaze for the porcelain, and the translucent glaze on the speckled stoneware, for me, there were too many speckles, if that can be a thing. So I played around making like a more opaque glaze, just to hide a little, just to have more variation. And I really like variation. So like with the porcelain, I had started doing a line where it was kind of two color. It was a color and then clear glaze, and it would make that third color in the middle, how you dipped it. And I liked that. I didn't love it, you know. A lot of people really liked it, but I don't know, it just it was okay. It's like just because I can make it doesn't mean I want to. But then that speckled stoneware and then the opaqueness of the glaze and the way the colors blended, I liked that a lot more. It just seemed really happy, you know? Like, to me, the speckles are kind of like, you know, like, well, they're not really glitter, but like confetti. Like, it's like a little party, you know? And I remember, so I was born in 1980, so my mom used to have stoneware all the time, and she used to have this little mug that she would always give me, and it had the speckles, and then it had, I don't remember, they used to like sponge glaze. That was a really big thing. It had the sponge glaze on it, and like that's my favorite mug. And so I think like that subconscious, like it's making those, it was like, oh, it reminded me of being a little kid. And so, and those bright colors, like I think a lot of times bright colors are more, some people, not everyone, think that bright colors are more childish or childlike, more playful. And I feel like that's me. Like I really don't try and take myself too seriously, you know? Oh, so I feel, yeah, that the brighter days, yeah, speaking to you about this, I'm like, the Brighter Days collection is me. You know, it's like very simple forms. Like they're very honest and just like upfront. They try and, you know, be positive. I'm done. I can stop making pottery now. Like
You figured it out.
I figured it out.
How much of your like overall production in a year is that versus say the drawn work, you know, that like you're putting like the chairs or like some type of graphic image on it?
Yeah, so I have like two lines. I have production line and then a one of a kind line. And I always kind of joke to myself that like the production line is like my teaching. So, you know, like some potters teach, the production line's my teaching. So that helps pay all the bill. I mean, the one of a kind work does too, but the production line, that really, you know, that's kind of, it's easy, it's simple, it's pretty, you know, you don't have to fuss much with it. So it's about, I think, so last year was weird because I started that line and I started about, I think, May. So it's usually about 40%, and then the one of a kind work, 40% revenue, I think is what you were asking. And the one of a kind is about 60, but we'll see after, you know, it fluctuates, but it's usually around 40, 60.
And is all your work thrown and then molds made, or is that just the Brighter Days?
No, it's all slip cast.
Is it? Okay.
Everything.
But starting from thrown pieces that you make kind of the prototype, right?
Yes.
In that way, you can use the same molds for both lines of work then.
Right. And what I'm trying to focus on, I just haven't, you know, I feel like maybe the older I don't know. I don't feel like I'm moving very fast. The point of the speckled stoneware and then the casting body, it's the same clay. So it's a Laguna clay. It's 608. And I make the casting slip based on the clay body. So I can take pieces, you know, I can buy like a 50-pound box of clay and add pieces to the slip cast pieces. And so that's what I'm trying to work towards now for like the one of a kind stuff to differentiate it more. I just haven't, you know, slow and steady.
Well, I like with the one of a kind work, a lot of it feels more like painting and drawing, you know, like the surface of the pots, like you'll often do a drawing and then do like multiple different colors, like not blobs. That makes it sound.
It's okay. I don't take myself seriously, so that's not going to offend me.
Good, because it's like sort of blobs or brush strokes that are around it, framing it. But what it allows you to do is frame the image, but also you get a lot of color in a relatively small amount of space. And it seems more exploratory just in general, like looking at that body of work, which I know as a maker, like I need that. I need that little bit of like, I am going to figure this out, and I don't have it dialed in as to where your production line, that feels dialed in. Like you could make 1,000 of those cups and it's going to work, most of the time.
Right. And that I've consciously built that in. Yes. Because as a maker, I need to explore. I've started this thing I call fun first. When we did the Boldly podcast, we had Osa Atoy on, and she was talking about at the beginning of her making cycle, she would play a little. And I was like, gosh, I really love that. And so I tried to do that, but I found that I would be like, well, I don't have time to play right now. So I wasn't doing it. So what I try and do is the first half an hour in the studio, I call it fun first. And I just do whatever. And it can be clay. Like for a while, I was dyeing fabric, which was really fun. But a lot of those patterns that I was dyeing became like, I made screens out of them so I could like screen print underglaze. Yes, you have to make money, but you have to have fun, right? Because when you were talking about the aesthetic of my work and the one of a kind line, I was like, I don't know if there's a real aesthetic. It's just kind of like, yeah, whatever I feel like.
Well, as an outsider looking in, the thing that I see is you have very specific color preferences. Like even there's, I think, connections between the Brighter Days, the wholesale work, and the one of a kind. There's still a color sensibility that you're choosing, and a lot of that's material. Like you're working at a temperature range and a specific kind of clay that does that. But I wanted to weave in pricing, because that's one of the themes we're going to talk about. How do you think about sort of the financial value of a new idea? So like a one-of-a-kind object, you're making different decisions. Do you put financial value on that? And how do you figure that out?
Okay, I'm going to try and answer this. So are you asking like that half an hour that I'm playing, like financially, like, am I paying myself for that?
Well, what I'm thinking is that with the wholesale line, you can almost calculate the money that you're going to make, because the pots are going to work. People like the designs. So if you make X amount of pots, even though it's based on the same idea, you're going to generate X amount of money.
Okay.
You can almost like plan your budget on how much you're going to do that wholesale. One of a kind stuff, though, is really different, because you might have an idea that's very fulfilling in the moment, but no one likes it. So then do you price that stuff lower so that people like it more, or do you price it higher because it is idea generation? And I think generating new ideas is inherently financially valuable.
It is, yes. Okay. So the way I think about it is, this might be controversial to say, it doesn't matter if people don't like it for the one of a kind things. I mean, it does matter because you have to sell it. But what really matters is if you like it. And I'm going to tell you why, because I've done art fairs. I did art fairs for so long. And I noticed if you're excited about what you're making, that's contagious. And if you like it, even if someone, because I don't know if you've ever seen someone's work, like they switch. Let's say they're doing porcelain and then they do stoneware. You're like, I don't like their new work, right? But they're excited about it. And then they keep talking about it. And then you keep seeing it. And you're like, well, actually, that's kind of cool. Like I didn't like it at first, but now I kind of do. And I think that you just have to remember that while you're doing the experimenting and you're playing around, like you really, like we talked about getting out of your head. You have to get out of your head. You have to remember why you started doing ceramics, like why you love it. That's what the fun first is for me. It's like, I love ceramics. This is why, like, that's easier said than done too, right? But you have to try to just be like, I'm going to make this thing. Like I've made little like pinch pots, like a beginner, just to kind of get your hands moving and just start feeling the clay. That's why I loved ceramics. It was like tactile. You could touch it. And so, yeah, I think that's really important. And so when I do like my pricing and that, and I didn't do this for a long time, is you have to like even pay yourself for that experimentation, if that makes sense. So you're doing your pricing structure. Of course, you're getting you pay yourself for the production time, but you also have to pay yourself for the experimentation. You even have to pay yourself for doing nothing. Because now listen, I know another being an artist, you have to sit and think. Like, I feel like that is an integral part of the process that people neglect to pay themselves for, and that's how people get burned out, because they think they should only get paid for production. And that is so unsustainable, at least in my opinion, it is. So.
Yeah, and creativity comes from rest, like you're talking about that.
Right.
I feel the same. And actually, I don't know when, I was doing a bunch of interviews in maybe like 2015, sometime in that area. And I kept talking to people about these big tech companies like Google and, all these ones that we would know. They had started doing this practice in their HR where they would give people an hour a week to do whatever they wanted. And some people would go, these were like California companies, so some people would go surfing, some people would go hiking, some people would work, like you got to choose what you did with that hour. But what they found is that tons of ideas came out when the people in the companies rested their mind and did something unrelated or seemingly unrelated. And I always remember that because my personality is that I feel like if I work hard enough, I'll have more success. But eventually that grinds my mind down and my body down. Like my body can't keep up with that. So having that rest, like this has been like one of the unlocking keys for me is like, how do you unlock creativity? Just stop. Stop doing what you're doing and do something different.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree.
So you mentioned that you have a pricing structure. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So this is a formula that I have taken from my friend, Megan Almond. She's a jeweler and also a business coach. She really knows her stuff. She really anyone's like, oh, where do I find more information? Go to her. So what she recommends is, I'm reading it. That's why I'm looking down. I printed it off. She recommends taking your materials plus your labor plus your overhead, and then that equals your bare minimum wholesale price. And when I was giving my little talk at NCECA, because I use this formula, I said, I know a lot of you are going to say, well, I don't want to wholesale my work, because a lot of people say that. I don't want to wholesale my work. Okay. But what if a dream gallery approaches you? And I use the example is, what if Seth Rogen wants you to make an ashtray for him, right? What are you going to do? Well, you have to take that bare minimum wholesale price and you have to keep going. And a lot of people stop at that price and they think this is my price. And then they keep like trying to produce pots 40 hours a week for, I don't know, maybe 45 weeks a year, and they burn themselves out because you can't like make all those pots and like take the photographs, sit, you can't rest, you can't like experiment. You can't, you just have, your mind can only do so many things, right? So you have to build the structure into your pricing. So what you're going to do is you're going to take that bare minimum wholesale price, and then you're going to do something crazy. It's not actually crazy. You add profit to that. And you can decide how much profit you want. But it's important to add that profit in because as a potter, not everything you make is going to turn out right, but you still have to get paid for making it. At least I think you should still get paid, even if it doesn't turn out. So you're going to add the profit into that. And then that actually gives you your wholesale price. And then you take the wholesale price and you multiply it by 2, and then you get the retail price.
And what's your multiplier for the profit on top of wholesale? Like, what do you usually do?
It varies. So like smaller pieces, your profit isn't going to be as much because, when when people see pottery and they see a small cup compared to like a large vase, if the cup is $40 and the vase is $200, that makes sense. So your profit, I just don't, it has to vary. So like on a cup, it might be $2, but on a large vase, it might be $100. And I don't feel bad about saying that.
No, I don't think you should. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about percentages too. Because one of the standard things when I was doing wholesale for another company is that the whatever price we did, they would often multiply to get their retail price 2.2. So
2.2.
they would actually be doubling it and then 20%. So I think, well, if the gallery is adding 20% on for just their profit, then why not add 20% on to wholesale? If you think that, like you said, it varies depending on if it's a cup or a vase or teapot or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
But I think it's interesting to think about these formulas. And so I want to back up into the formula a little bit. The overhead, the problem I've always had is that I'm always looking at my overhead now, not what's the overhead in 5 years. Because ideally, you're going to need to grow. And so I've had to like make myself think, okay, if I'm going to buy a kiln in 5 years, and then I'm going to divide the cost of the kiln up by the pots I make from now for the next 5 years, then I really need to increase my overhead more than actually what it is now. And I've had to just make myself do that so that because I have this thing where it's like, I just think all the costs are going to be the same, and they're not. Like, costs go up, you need to expand, you need to replace equipment. All that has to be accounted for in that wholesale price or the retail, depending on what you're doing.
Right. It does. And the other thing is you might have to go over this every year. I know a lot of people are like, I don't want to do it. And that's how I was. I did it once and then I was like, I don't want to do it again. But the problem was I didn't figure it out correctly. And then all those years that I didn't, take the time to calculate it correctly, I was burning myself out. So you do. I usually do it in January because it's usually slower in January. And just kind of it's not the fun part. Well, I don't think it's the fun part, but the business aspect. So a lot of times, like I'll do my accounting the first Monday of the month. I found it's just easier than trying to do it all at the end of the year. And then I have numbers right away that I can just plug into the formula and figure it out.
When I'm talking about pricing with people that are not potters, I'm always interested in their reaction. Because like if you're like me, like you want to figure it out as if the right price will make the object better. But what's funny is people that aren't potters, they do it the opposite way. They think like, this is a beautiful object and I'm willing to pay maybe more than you think than we think it is. So some of this goes into kind of confidence, building confidence in pricing. How did you think that you've been able to do that over time and just trust that like, hey, if people really want that, they will pay way more than maybe I think it is worth?
That's a good question. I didn't have any confidence. I didn't, and then like COVID hit and then the lockdown, and you probably remember people were just buying online like crazy. And, that's really when the one of a kind work, the pricing started to go up because, I just couldn't keep up. And that's also when something felt off. Like I always refer to a lot of my life things. I'm like, something didn't feel right. And that's when I started to notice, particularly with like the wholesale line that I was doing at that time, that I was exhausted, like exhausted. And I mean, I was sleeping at night, but I was still like exhausted. And I was getting like really resentful of people, like I'm supposed to like my well, I mean, you're not supposed to, but appreciate them, right? And I was just like angry and I was like, something's really off. And so I don't know if you know this story, but in March of 2021, I had like a hate letter sent to the studio.
Whoa, no.
Yeah, about my pricing. And a woman, I don't know if it's a woman, I should say a person wrote me a letter. It was anonymous, that they had purchased things from me before at art fairs, and they couldn't believe how I was charging for my work, what I was charging for my work now, and that I was going to price myself out of business. And they signed it, someone who cares.
How did you take the letter?
Well, at first, I laughed because it's really, it's funny. But then it just started to kind of like wormhole into my brain. And I thought, oh, like, what if this person's right? And it was like all the self-doubt that I had thought they had hit the head on the nail. And I was like, oh no. And that was hard. Like I'll admit I cried about it because it hurt. But then slowly I was like, you know what? It doesn't matter what they think. It doesn't matter. Because like the numbers aren't going to lie. They're not. And this is what I need to charge to pay my bills. And what started to happen was, it was like, well, if someone won't buy it, there's someone that will. Even today, I still tell myself that, like, if someone doesn't want to pay $92 for a mug, there's someone that will. And I just kept repeating that over and over, and like every day, like, someone will find value in what I do. Like, I find value in what I do. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about before. And if you're making work that you're excited about, that's kind of contagious. If you're making work and you believe that it's priced for what it's worth, other people are going to start believing it too,
Yeah, the mug is an interesting example. I feel like that's kind of the standard measure across potters' ways of making. And for me, the thing that as I went into full-time making for myself after being a production potter for other people, what I was not taking into account was inflation. So I kind of had my mug price, and I'm trying to think, this was maybe 2002. And the mug price, I would say, was like $32. And I was really fretting, could I move it up to $42? And so it took me all this like confidence, like, yes, people will pay $42 in 2002. But then from 2002 to 2022, I did not increase my prices with the rate of inflation. So as I got better, the value of my work actually went down, which is weird. Like, that's not good. As your skills get better, you want the value of your work to go up. So do you think about kind of a standard measure of inflation? I know this last year was weird because it was 10% or whatever it was in the US, but do you do like a standard measure that you just raise every year no matter what because inflation is inflation?
I don't, but now I'm like, oh, maybe I should. But, I do go over the numbers every year and I'll adjust if I need to. But no, I don't. But I do tell people because I think sometimes I feel like a broken record now, especially with my friends. I'm like, you need to raise your prices. You need to raise your prices. And so I just started saying, if you haven't raised your prices 8%, because I think that's what inflation is. I was like, you're losing 8%. And it's a real problem if you're pricing, you're not, your prices aren't correct. If you're already undercharging and then you don't at least raise your prices 8%.
I'm so glad you got in touch with me to talk about pricing because I feel like we should just have this conversation every year on the podcast, just as like a way to like engage people around the concept that it's changing. It's not like you figure it out once and then you figured it out for life. I mean, I do like that you have a formula because that is something you can turn back to. But my quote unquote formula changed when I had a daughter because I was like, my needs in one life event, my needs went up drastically because then I was like, oh, I've got to actually save for retirement and I've got to save for her school. You know what I mean? Like, it changed my whole mindset in a way that my prices have gone up. And, I've sold less since she's been born, but I've made more money.
Right.
So I think, and that's okay. Like, that's a natural thing.
Yeah. That's been really hard for me to transition because I've been, I undercharged for so long. And so I was so used to cranking it out, and now, like you said, when you raise your prices, you sell less, but you make more money. But there's a part of me that's still like, well, no, I need to make like 200 mugs. And I'm like, no, no, you don't, So then it's like, oh, well, what do I do with this extra time? And it's like, you're going to experiment. And I'm like, wait, I can have the life I want, and you can. I mean, you don't get everything you want, but you can, spend a little more time playing in the studio.
I wanted to circle back to something you said, I think before we started recording, but that in your studio space, you're going around and kind of renovating different rooms in the building. How much do you, let's say that you raise your prices and you are accurately, how do I describe this? You're priced right for your market. So you're selling well, you're actually saving money. How do you then decide how to invest that money back into the business?
So I am a person who, delayed gratification. I am really, and I think it's just from being a broke potter for so long. I couldn't afford things, So it's like, okay, well, I will save up for this or I'll save up for that, And so that's what I do. I usually try and save up for things before I do it. But you'll start to notice, right now I have a kiln. So I have a scut. I have a 1027 and then I have a 1227. The 1227 is 2 years old. The 1020, and I think this is important that people know this. The 1027 was made in 1984. And I got it from a lady had purchased it and she only used it 3 times. And so I bought it for $1,000. It's a great kiln. But again, it was made in 1984. I'm just like, well, that kiln, I'm probably going to have to replace it sooner than later. So, I'm just saving little bits of money to replace it. So, and I know you can buy them and take out financing and that, but I've done that before and it really, some people can do it and it doesn't bother them, but when you don't know, when your income varies so much, for me, I prefer to me, it's less stressful if I can just save up for something and purchase it, and that might not always be the way.
It makes business sense because then, let's say if you buy it on a credit card and you didn't save up, then you're paying the interest on the purchase, which is not a good idea. So I like the idea of that you just plan and save and plan and save. And I mean, that's functionally how it's worked out for me. I talked about earlier that I should add profit on for future investment, but the reality is I usually don't invest until I have to,
Right. Right. Yeah. I understand that. And then going back to when I did art fairs, because you have so many booth fees due at one time. I know some people who were better with their money than I am would save up that money and, have it available. And some people would have a line of credit. I would put it on a credit card and then as soon as I was done with that art fair, I would pay that booth fee off. I was just going to say there's a lot of shame around money. It's just money. If you're bad with money, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means maybe you don't have the experience, right? Because I wasn't always good with money at all. And it didn't mean I was a bad person. It just meant I didn't have the experience, No shame. No shame.
To wrap up, can you leave your website or social media so people could get in touch if they want to talk more about this?
Sure. On Instagram, I'm at Bellajoy Pottery, and my website is also bellajoypottery.com.
Well, thanks so much. This was great. It's good to see you.
You too. Thanks, Ben.
I'd like to thank Heidi for doing this interview. It was a pleasure to chat with her, and I appreciate her sharing her story. Before we go, I did want to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in being a sponsor on this show or any of the ones on the Brickyard Network, you can check out our website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.